academic and non-academic institutions across the world. We're a very diverse student body. It's an extremely international, cosmopolitan environment and academic community. We do specialize in the study of the non-Western world, so we're very outward looking and very committed to exchanging and contributing and participating with people, whether they are academics or practitioners of development, or whether they are members of the general population in the countries where we work. We're highly committed to the decolonial approaches, which we believe should be even more extensively taken up than they are being more broadly outside at the academy than they are currently. And in combination with that kind of familiarity, that intimacy of a small campus, we really pride ourselves on having a very, very kind of friendly and a very inclusive and welcoming environment for students. I genuinely can report to you that our students tell me frequently that they've found the other students, the welcome of the academics at SOAS, something very, very reassuring. I was yesterday afternoon meeting with one of my Japanese students who, in fact, I did meet in Tokyo when I was there earlier in the year. And she was telling me about her first year, her first term and how it's been going. She really said, one of the great things is that the other students are so friendly and welcoming that you find yourself comfortable socially, but also enabled intellectually. It's possible to be relaxed, to work hard, to work with other people and to get, really very far. So if you study development in our department at SOAS, what you receive in a sense is two broad areas of learning. You of course learn a very large amount about the content of your subject of study, so about development studies broadly and about whatever specialization you select for your specific program. And I'm going to list the programs and their specializations in a second. So that, of course, is extremely important. You get a deep understanding of processes of global social change, a deep understanding of the specific issues and challenges in global development. In addition to that, you get a very strong interdisciplinary social science training. So what we're really keen to do is to help you learn and practice and refine your use of some of these key skills which are so valuable in working in and on development, including critical thinking, evidence analysis, really learning how to ask the right fundamental questions about global processes. And in combination, these two elements, the subject-specific and the skills training, really provide you with excellent foundations for any subsequent move forward in your career, whether you want to remain in academia, whether you're thinking about doing a PhD after your master's program, whether you're keen to expand and build on the networks that you start to build while you're at SOAS, working in a development organization or in a development-related field. These are all things that we feel that you're very well prepared for when you've completed a program of study in development studies at SOAS. So you'll probably already know from the rankings, which I'm sure that you're all quite rightly investigating and exploring, that the Department of Development Studies at SOAS ranks third in the world. So we're very, very high up internationally. We're very well regarded. When we as academics travel around the world engaging with other academics and researchers, we find, that people know who we are, they are familiar with us. Often they know people who have studied with them. I've even had colleagues who, when traveling to carry out research, have ended up coming back and joking that they have found themselves in rather remote locations conducting research only to bump into somebody who says, oh yes, I went to SOAS, or my friend went to SOAS. So it's really got a very extensive reach, even though, as I said, we're a relatively small organization. So we've got more than 30 permanent staff members now in the department. So we're quite a large department from a wide range of different countries, and very importantly, from a range of disciplinary and practice backgrounds. So there are people who are, really kind of strongly academic and research-based in their orientation. There are other people who combine those activities with continuing to work in different relationships and formats with and for development organizations. We've all got experience working on and with global development organizations, whether that's at the level of government, in organizations like trade unions, in international NGOs, United Nations organizations, civil society organizations. I myself have conducted research consultancies and kind of applied commissioned policy research for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and for other consortia of humanitarian organizations. So this is very common in the department. Most of our colleagues have got those kinds of networks and those kinds of experiences. And we're all engaged, therefore, in ongoing policy debates and action. And, we can draw on those experiences and those examples in our teaching. So our students report that it's rather a kind of lively and interesting teaching environment when you can really quite literally be talking to somebody who is practicing the very activities that you're learning about alongside their academic work. For example, one of my colleagues, Professor Jonathan Goodhand, is currently seconded from the department for half of his time every week to the UK government Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So he's employed there through SOAS as an advisor, a strategic advisor on the British government's response to conflict around the world, advising them on how best to intervene, what a good evidence-based response to conflict situations around the world would be. So that's extremely enriching. It's very important work in and of itself, but it's also amazing for students to be able to hear about those kinds of experiences alongside their studying, their reading, their thinking and writing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we've got quite a number of different programs, and even we have study available in different formats in the department as well. I'll begin with the on-campus programs, so face-to-face on-campus programs, taught degree programs. You'll probably be aware that it is, of course, also possible to apply to SOAS for a research degree program, an MPhil PhD, and that normally requires a master's qualification in order to gain entry at that level. But that's very much something that's also part of our profile. So on campus, we have a range of master's programs. These are all one-year taught programs which involve 2 semesters of academic study and assessment, and in the third period of time in which students write a dissertation of 10,000 words. That's the same across all of the programs, but of course the content of the programs is different. They are 12-month programs because of the need to allow time for the dissertation. So as you can see, we have one generalist program in global development. This is our broadest and most inclusive program, which is really good for a non-specialist. It really introduces you to many of the different approaches and areas of work in global development, providing both a kind of political, historical, sociological introduction, and also focusing in one of the core modules in the political economy of global development. So these are very important fundamental programs of study within this global development program. Some of the elements of that global development program are also available to students in other specialized MSc programs, which also have their own particular thematic core module. So consequently, you can see as we read down the list, we've got the MSc in Politics and Development, the MSc Humanitarian Aid and Conflict, Migration, Mobility and Development, the MSc Violence, Conflict and Development, and finally an MSc in Research for International Development, which really kind of develops and explores the different kinds of strategy available for conducting research in situations of global development. So what you'll find is that altogether, the students who take these programs make up a very significant student body. Within SOAS, we're one of the biggest departments, and we're one of the departments with the largest community of postgraduate students. So we've got well over 200 students who are taking these MSc programs on a year-to-year basis. In addition, we have a smaller number, but still a significant number of undergraduate students, and they will be taking either the BA in Global Development, which allows them to take a specialized 3-year undergraduate honours degree in issues of global development, or students can opt within SOAS to take a 2-subject undergraduate degree. So in this case, they can team the global development portion of their degree with a wide range of other subjects also offered at SOAS. So some common combinations will be students who are taking a BA undergraduate degree in global development and politics, or global development and economics, or even global development and anthropology. So you can look on the website to get more information about combinations that are available, and you can also for sure be in touch with us so that we can answer any questions that you may have about them. Now, in addition to the on-campus programs, we also offer a number of online distance learning programs, and this makes it possible for students who, for whatever reason, are not free to come to London and to physically spend a year here carrying out their studies. They can take on a slightly different basis and organized in a slightly different way very similar kinds of academic modules, which over a longer period of time, because these degrees are usually done on a part-time basis, often by people who are continuing to work in development as they study. And then you take over a period of years, sometimes 2 or 3 years, a number of modules which eventually lead to work on a dissertation just in the same way as in the on-campus programs. And so here we've got specialized programs in humanitarian, in international development, in climate change and development, and in sustainable development. And all of, the different kind of variations within those programs are described in a bit more detail on our website. And each of these programs has a convener, which is to say an academic who's in charge of overseeing those programs, managing them, and interacting with students. All of these people are more than happy to have conversations with prospective candidates. If you want to have a chat over Zoom, or if you want to send an email inquiry, those are certainly available as options. So in our undergraduate degree, to start with, and then I'll go on to talk a bit about the content of our kind of wider MSc teaching. In the undergraduate degree, we're very clear that what we're offering is an interdisciplinary social sciences degree, and it focuses on how societies change, on debates about what constitutes progress, and interventions aiming to bring that about. It's very much about global challenges and about how the continuities and interactions between different populations in different parts of the world influence each other, if you like, are interdependent in some important ways, as well as focusing on local experiences and what poverty and progress feel like to different people around the world. Sometimes we find that the kinds of discourses and languages which are used by different kinds of actors at different levels of society, internationally and nationally, to talk about similar material experiences or challenges are very different, and that it actually is necessary to begin a kind of an inquiry into a particular domain of development studies by really seeking to clarify what is understood by the terms that are being used by the different stakeholders. Power relations, of course, enter into this as well. So just to summarize, who are we? We're a global community with a London base. We are extremely fortunate to be based right in the middle of Bloomsbury in central London, on the edge of a beautiful green square with lovely planting and trees in an area of beautiful architectural renown. We're very close to the British Museum, if people are familiar with the layout of this part of London. We're about a 2-minute walk from the British Museum and very close to other academic institutions as well. I've already mentioned that we have very large numbers of postgraduate students every year, so we have a large and dynamic student body. We've also got 50 or more PhD students at different stages of their work. We've got undergraduate students, as I've said, both in the department exclusively and 2 subject degrees. You can imagine with this number of students that we have a very extensive community of alumni, many of whom stay closely in touch with us and continue to participate in activities in person if they're in London, or online and remotely if they're not. We've got a network of global research and policy partners working with our staff, with our PhD students, and sometimes also with our students. We're quite a kind of a lively department. There are people arriving, bringing in fresh ideas and perspectives all the time. The colleagues listed on the right-hand side of the slide, Professor Naomi Hussain, Professor Dzodzi Tsikata, and Professor RKB Metiku are recent arrivals. They have, in some cases, had contacts with the department before over a long time. RKB, for example, did his PhD with us several years ago before going back to work in government at quite a high level in Ethiopia. And now he's come back to work with us in a research capacity. And we're very excited to have all of them. Okay, let's think a little bit about the actual subject of study. When we are thinking about studying global development, what is it that we are focused on? What is it that we're interested in? I think we really understand development as a term to make reference to 2 different types or dimensions of experience. On the one hand, we're looking at the processes through which societies change over time, driven by historical, political, economic, and other agendas and activities. We can see that inevitably, as time passes, the world changes, and it changes in different ways, in different places, and with different consequences for the people who live in those different places. Now that, is an important backdrop to all of our lives. But it's also true that there are a good number of people, including people working for development organizations, who are explicitly seeking to participate in promoting and guiding that change. So what kind of development activities do those institutions and organizations come up with? What do they want to do? How do they want to do it? And what are the visions, their development visions, if you like, that are guiding their activities? So we're interested in development in both of those formulations, if you like. We're interested in both how societies do change and are changing, and how they should change. And from a SOAS perspective, and from a development department at SOAS perspective, we have a very kind of deep-rooted interest and commitment to issues of social justice. So when we're thinking about how societies should change, we entirely recognize that there are different ideas and different visions, and that what's important is discussion and debate and conversation about those objectives. But we're very clear amongst ourselves that what we're interested in is promoting changes in the world which support the development and the improvement of the life chances of people in the world who are currently living in disadvantaged situations, whether because they are being obliged to exist in situations of poverty, or whether because their lives are badly affected by, let's say, external interventions like conflict activities, or whether they're affected by climate change and environmental changes in the world around them. This leads us to a series of questions about why it is and how it is that some regions are more apparently developed than others, and what this tells us about the history, the power relations, and the politics of both those specific country contexts, and also the international institutional and governmental organizations and consortia and groupings that come together to make decisions which affect everybody. So who gets to define whether a particular context is developed or not? Is it the people who live in it? Is it international commentators? Is it governments? Is it the United Nations? What policies and structures have made change happen, for better or for worse? What can we learn from those? How have certain actors captured control over development processes and policies? One of the ways, there are lots of ways that we explore that, but one of the ways that it's possible to investigate those questions, those final questions, is through looking at development financing. Where does the finance come from to support the development interventions which are being offered? Can we say that they're offered evenly, that there is, if you like, equity in the way development programming is distributed? Or are there kind of political factors which are coming into play, which might have an important impact on the extent to which that's the case? Who is development good for? Does it benefit everyone equally? I think, you know, the answers to these questions are very, very complex and very context specific, but very fascinating to explore and investigate. Right then. So also at the level of the master's degree programs, the postgraduate talk programs in the department, we're looking very clearly at a social science interdisciplinary approach. So you will find academics in our department who are expert in each and all of these disciplines, these areas of academic inquiry, and sometimes people who have expertise in others as well, because we're interested in specific contexts, in work at the empirical level. You know, we're interested in carrying out research, being with people, understanding what's going on, using different disciplinary perspectives as tools, if you like, in order to be able to do that. We really think that this helps us to take an approach to global development which has, on the one hand, a global focus on global challenges. We're looking at the world across the board, if you like. We're trying to identify themes and developments, but we're also always interested in the local focus, and we're interested in looking at how things like inequality, poverty, vulnerability, and development are constructed at the local level, because two countries where the populations are living in poverty do not necessarily have the same history, experience, causality. And it may be that the way that income or assets are distributed within a country are very different, so that different types of groups of people are advantaged or disadvantaged depending on what's happening in the country at that moment. Things are very kind of raw and fresh in this context, but you will probably have been following the news reports of the dramatic changes in Syria over the last few days. What we know is that there was vast wealth and resources available to the ruling family and their political kind of constituencies. The former president, the authoritarian leader of the country, al-Assad, has now fled the country, reportedly taking vast amounts of wealth with him to Russia, where he's gone into exile. There are questions about the way that his networks, his patronage networks, let's say, exported wealth from the center through the population in Syria, but of course extremely selectively, so that some people did very well out of their associations with the ruling faction and with the relationships that they had with them, whereas others not only didn't have any opportunity to access resources or opportunities, but were explicitly targeted and exploited and vulnerabilized, if you like, by the authoritarian governance style there. It's very, very complex. It's necessary to dig very deep in order to be able to understand what's going on in a situation of that kind. But it does raise some very compelling questions about what development looks like in a context of such complexity. And, this is one of the things that we find fascinating to look at. So as I've made very clear already, our programs, I think, are unlike other programs in development studies because we really are able to drill down into very context-specific perspectives, employing those skills and those interests that I've been talking about. Because we have an academic body and indeed a student body who are outward-looking, who are activists, who are engaged with what's going on in the world, we have a kind of an incredible opportunity to both learn in the academy and also outside in the world, and also to have an influence on policy, to be called on to express an opinion, to share our expertise. And this makes it a very dynamic and lively environment for students. Many of the staff in the department are quite regularly invited to appear in media broadcasts, to contribute to journalism and kind of popular discussion and debate about academic issues, as well as contributing in the more traditional, conventional academic settings, academic conferences, academic peer-reviewed journal articles, and so on. So that's quite, an important thing. So, these are just a few of the projects which have been carried out in the department over the last couple of years, where you can really see conversations taking place which bridge the academic and wider communities, if you like. My former colleague, Professor Navtej Purwal, carried out a very fascinating project looking at how public narratives and memories of partition in Britain have developed and changed over time, including through the use of virtual reality, and as well as producing academic outputs which described and discuss her work on the consequences of partition between India and Pakistan in the 40s. In academic settings. Navtej also put on exhibitions and welcomed members of the public into them, and then used this very innovative idea of using virtual reality headsets to give people an opportunity to immerse themselves in those environments and those situations. It was incredibly well received and very kind of interesting to see. On the other hand, Jonathan Goodhand, who I mentioned earlier, has just completed a very big and important research project in which he managed a very large team of researchers to look at the role of the drug trade and other illegal economic activities in a whole range of conflict and post-conflict affected countries, Afghanistan, Colombia, Myanmar, really looking both from the top down. So, looking at what is the international response and regulation and views about international war economies, if you like, including drug economies. And how does this play out at the local level? So, for example, the team carried out some village level field research in Colombia, working with farmers of relatively remote rural areas who were, in their own account, more or less obliged to grow coca leaves, which fed the drugs trade, because they couldn't find a market for more conventional agricultural crops because of the dynamics of the war in the area, the fact that the infrastructure of the area had been significantly destroyed, and because of the kind of the political and military presence, if you like, of different conflict actors. So what the team did was look at some really very kind of practical ideas about how to support those farmers to move away from those illegal activities, but in ways that protected their livelihoods, that recognized their community roles, and so on. So it was a very interesting project, and you can read more about it on the SOAS webpage. We've got SOAS colleagues who are, through our Development Centre for Transformation, either finding shorter, kind of more policy relevant ways of engaging, of providing information to the wider community, or finding really original ways of representing and sharing and disseminating their research. So we've got people including an organization called Positive Negatives connected to SOAS, which is producing comics, animations, and podcasts on social and humanitarian issues, and really managing in that way to reach populations who might not otherwise have ever had a chance to have access to academic research. These are all things that excite and enliven the environment for our students. They really find it, incredibly kind of enriching to have their regular scheduled classes and to do their work and their assignments, but also to have all of this other very, very lively, rich intellectual activity taking place. And the Development Leadership Dialogue Institute is, again, a fairly recent innovation where there's a very kind of clear plan and agenda to have the kinds of conversations about development interventions and about the kind of possibilities available to leaders in the developing world about how to promote the well-being of their wider populations. And that leads to a series of events and seminars that students are also welcome to participate in. So all of these things, I think, point to our desire to share, to be involved, to make ourselves accessible, to do high quality work, but to really, kind of ensure that we are doing it in a way which is collegial and collaborative, which acknowledges and embraces the fact that Western perspectives and Eurocentric kind of views of how the world is and how it works are of limited use to people who are citizens of a global environment, and that we really are much more excited about learning how to share and how to work together in those ways. We're very happy to do all of this exciting work in SOAS, in the middle of London, in this really, rather wonderful environment. And we have some really nice buildings and facilities. The picture you can see on the screen is one of the places where our students like to hang out when they're having a coffee, when they've come out of the library, and it's very nice as well. In that same hall where some of those students were standing, we have a variety of student services, including the careers service, which really helps students while they're doing their studies to think through what's useful for them in the academic work that they're doing and how they can apply it by thinking about doing internships or becoming, familiar with and expert in the kinds of institutions and organizations that they think that may like to go and work with afterwards. And we really have students in a very wide range of contexts and locations, working, some of them directly in development organizations, in a very wide range of geographical locations, but also people working in research, people working in governments and in donor organizations, and also a lot of people working in journalism and in a whole range of kind of newer form organizations increasingly becoming involved in development, in philanthropy organizations, in private sector, very, very wide range of contexts as well. The last few minutes of my talk, I want to spend giving you a little bit of an insight into the kind of teaching that we do at SOAS. And what I've decided to share with you is some slides which reflect on the relationship between development and inequality. And I think that these are very fundamental issues when we ask this important question, whose development counts? Which are the stakeholders in the global economy who get to have a say to participate in decision making and to assert their preferences and their priorities for the way that change happens in their communities and in their countries? So the opening proposition is the very well documented fact that global inequality is very, very high. Over the last 20 or 30 years, it has increased at a very rapid rate. And the consequences of this are absolutely critical. we're looking at vast disparities of wealth and income distribution across the world. And that inequality is both between countries, but also within individual countries. So it's clearly the case that there are states in the world which are much, much more prosperous than other states, but also within states, whether they are in the global north or in the global south, there are also very high levels of inequality. And these are influenced by factors which cut across, the entire globalized environment, if you like. You can see from the table on the right-hand side, whose source is listed on the slide, which can be shared with you, that the poorest 50% of people in the world own only 2% of the available wealth, whereas the richest 10% of people own 76% of global wealth. You can see the breakdown is a bit more detailed than that as well. But you instantly see that this issue of access to wealth, access to assets and resources is extremely kind of pressing, if you like. And it's pressing both, in and of its own sake, if you like, but also because of what that means for the people who are disadvantaged, who are disenfranchised in that system. What we know, and a lot of work has been done on this in research terms since COVID-19, but this is something which has been building up and increasingly, as I've said, over several decades before that, is that there are incredibly negative developmental outcomes associated with inequality. Yeah.
Tanya, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure if it
Alberto.
was me, but I think your voice disappeared for about 10 seconds. Could you rewind about
Okay.
15 seconds if you don't mind? Sorry.
Okay, to the beginning of this slide about COVID?
Yeah, halfway through
Or
the
before that?
previous slide. That's okay.
Okay, let me just go back.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so listen, what I'm sorry that if you had an interruption in the audio there. So what I was emphasizing in relation to this slide is that there are very significant consequences for this kind of dramatically uneven distribution of wealth around the world, both between countries and within individual countries in the global north and south. They are all affected by international, globalized issues, if you like. So globalization practices, economic policies, the historical development trends in those countries. But the consequences are that there are very small numbers of people doing very well indeed, and very large numbers of people who are living in very, very difficult circumstances economically. And the academic research which has been conducted, particularly since the global experience of COVID-19, which itself significantly exacerbated inequality, has shown the kind of the human consequences, if you like, the human development consequences of inequality and experiences of inequality. So what we find in the research is that inequality has increased over the course of COVID and its aftermath globally, but that there are very, very clear development negatives associated with this increase. So we have larger numbers of people who are suffering very significantly from poorer health outcomes and eventually suffering much higher mortality. So the death rate amongst people who are disadvantaged in terms of access to social services, access to health services, but also to education and other social services have really become, incredibly clear. Now, there are contradictions within this. Not only is it the fact that very, very wealthy people and countries are able to kind of capture a disproportionate share of the world's resources, but they're also disproportionately polluting, and by doing so, in climate terms, also negatively impacting on populations who are at the bottom end of the economic ladder. So we know, for example, that it is countries in the global north who are historically the main polluters, the precipitators of climate change and the consequences of climate change, but that it is nevertheless the citizens of countries in the global south who, at the moment at least, are significantly more likely to be suffering the consequences of those changes. So, for example, people displaced in Bangladesh because of soil erosion and coastal erosion, land becoming unusable for agricultural purposes because it has become salty. These are people who were already relatively poorly off economically. And it's very much the case that those risks are correlated, in a sense, to poverty and to inequality. It's very much the case that we need to take an intersectional understanding of inequality, where we see that everybody's chances of making a success of their lives and their experiences are not the same. It's very clear if we look at the global data that race and gender, as well as a wide range of other identity characteristics, correlate to opportunity in very, very important ways. And two very brief examples, I think, that it's worth speaking to, which really kind of emphasize the fact that these wider globalized phenomenon and processes are influencing in very detailed way the interventions which are taking place in different locations and the success that they're likely to meet are, as is listed on this slide, some of these kinds of very macro structural level obstacles or interventions and processes which have different outcomes in different contexts. One very important example, which I think really points up the need for this specifically intersectional analysis, is in the experience of South Asian women who are attempting to access for themselves both income generating activities, but also the opportunity to move into new social roles, which perhaps have not been historically encouraged or enjoyed, but which have kind of limited their economic opportunities. But we find that, using a development lens, we can start trying to understand the way that their difficulties, the challenges that they face, are really directly connected to their identities as women who are members of a particular economic class, who are thereby limited in terms of the networks that they have and the assets available to them, and also their caste identities, which can, really introduce a greater level of complexity in terms of the obstacles that they're faced with. All of these things are taking place for women in South Asia across a range of contexts. And colleagues of mine, including Alessandra Mezzadri, have used social reproduction theory that really kind of shows how these different elements connect to each other in producing disadvantage for women in such situations. A very different way of thinking about inequality is looking at the context of humanitarian action and asking, some rather kind of challenging questions about what it is that defines whether a particular environment receives the support it needs across countries in the global environment, in the global context. And I think that this slide showing data from UNHCR about funding for humanitarian emergencies around the world shows you a very compelling story. So first of all, that overall inequality is increased by the fact that there is insufficient humanitarian funding for global needs across all of the crises that we're aware of in the world today. If we ask the question, is what money available evenly distributed across different contexts? The answer is a very strong no, it's not. 40% of international humanitarian assistance in 2021, which is the last year for which UNHCR has produced these figures, went to only 5 countries. It's very clear that there are many, many more places which are, relatively speaking, receiving much, much lower inputs. And actually, those data are very readily available, partly from UNHCR, partly from organizations like Global Humanitarian Assistance. So funding gaps are not evenly distributed. And, what what we end up needing to ask is why this is the case. Why are some places identified as deserving of intervention in humanitarian terms, while other places are much less considered? The example of Uganda, I think, is a really compelling one, because this is a country which has received very large amounts of humanitarian funding over the years because it hosts very large numbers of refugees. But if you look at the infographic at the bottom of the screen, what you'll see is that the programs which UNHCR wants to operate in Uganda, which it regards as crucial to carry out, are funded up to less than half of the total amount of funding needed. And that obviously means that there are people who are left not just without positive developmental opportunities, but in some cases even without the basics of life. So the inequality that you find, whether it's in agricultural communities in South Asia or in refugee communities in Uganda, are linked together by some of these different causalities. What we're really looking to encourage is applications to come to SOAS from students who are really excited about these kinds of issues, who are interested in pursuing these kinds of questions, they're motivated, they care about the world, they want to make a difference in the world. And, we really warmly invite people to think about coming to SOAS to benefit from this very rich and exciting environment. We're always really super happy to receive contact from people, to answer questions and to be in touch. So I would really warmly encourage you to ask questions right now, but also to continue to be in touch with us if you'd like to talk over any of the things that you have heard today. And I hope that this has been somewhat helpful for you. I'm going to hand back over to my colleagues and we'll take some questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tania. So can we proceed the Q&A time?
Yes, for sure.
Okay. しましたら、講義の方はここまでになるんですけれども、ご質問などございましたら、チャットもしくはミュート解除していただいて、ご質問をいただければと思います。
講義についての質問ですか、それか、全体、
はい。
SOASに入学する件についても質問しても大丈夫ですか？
どちらでも大丈夫です。デベロップメントスタディーズだけでなく、ジェネラルな内容につきましては、アルベルトさんの方からご質問にお答えさせていただきます。
はい、ありがとうございます。
はい。
So, may I ask a question? Dr. Tania?
Please. Hi.
So, thank you very much for your lecture. It was really lovely, and it's a pleasure to meet you
you.
today. Because I'm applying to Humanitarianism Aid and Conflict Program. It's MSc program.
Mhm.
And yes, as you are an expert in post-migration studies, and I have almost the same interest in refugee and post-displacement. So I'd like to hear the brief essence for now. My question is, how can we combine development projects, so-called development projects, and humanitarian operations in emergency situations and protracted refugee situations, for example? How can organizations of related fields working in the field transform the structure of current development and humanitarian assistance if we want to combine these two to improve effectiveness? What do you think? Sorry for asking a very abstract question.
No, it's a great question. I'm very warmly looking forward to receiving you in our classes, because it's going to take a term to answer that question. But I'm extremely happy to give it a go. Actually, we had a very interesting talk yesterday, organized by one of my colleagues, Anna Lindley, who invited speakers from formerly from UNHCR and from a professor of migration policy, who came in and talked with our students about the consequences of the Global Compact of Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees on precisely the kinds of situations that you're asking about. And, you know, kind of, I think what they really brought to the table was a sense that there's an important kind of tension which exists between, on the one hand, you know, the arguably neoliberally motivated push towards self-reliance for refugees, which is often kind of, you know, glossed under the umbrella of a more developmental intervention. And on the other hand, the need to assure for the protection of refugees, you know, because there is, I mean, I think it's agreed across the humanitarian sector that it can only make sense, you know, it's a good idea to try to find longer term, more developmentally oriented supportive interventions for refugee populations in countries of exile. But unfortunately, I think one of the things which has happened in the policy domain is that this idea has been translated into a series of interventions which assume kind of a strong, healthy, entrepreneurial refugee subject who is then expected to kind of take advantage of, let's say, credit opportunities or, you know, other interventions to, you know, make good for themselves, which is fine as far as it goes, but leaves kind of unaddressed the question of what happens to people who are old or sick or disabled or, you know, not able to access those kinds of opportunities, whose protection, you know, risks being compromised in a way. So I think that that's I mean, you know, I'll be interested to talk it over with you later in the year, hopefully, but it's very hard, you know, to see that kind of opposition being resolved at the moment.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
手を挙げていただいている榎田さんからご質問どうぞ。
Thank you very much for lecture and presentation. I'm Yuri and I'm very interested in your MSc Global Development General course, and I'm currently preparing my application for 2025. Actually, not my question is not specific, but more kind of general things in the current situation. So in recent news, I feel like more was occurring and people were becoming more divided. And then I learned international law at my bachelor degrees, but I think now all the international laws and the international cooperation is facing kind of more difficulties or challenging. What do you think about the problem, do you think it's affect your studies? Sorry, my question is clear.
Let me just clarify. Are you asking about whether there are negative consequences for students traveling and studying internationally, or about the kind of opportunities that are available to them, or more about the development programs and the impact on them?
Yes, my question is more about like your studies, not kind of like the study abroad, but more specific on your studies or like the global development approach. Do you think you get some affected by this situation or not?
I understand. Thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, it's a good question. And I think, you know, one of the things that's very clear is that things are changing quite rapidly. And actually, the development sector, I think, is having to respond by transforming itself as well. And I think that there are some institutions which remain at the kind of the heart of the development regime, which are still, you know, very kind of central and important. Some of the UN organizations, UNDP, UNICEF, UNHCR, you know, these institutions are still working with states. States remain the preeminent kind of development actor. I think perhaps at the level of smaller organizations and community-based organizations that are supported, you know, from external sources in regions where there are programs taking place. I think that they're having to be quite creative, in a very difficult funding environment for a start, at kind of really identifying very strategic and focused target interventions, and then working with local groups to try to make them happen. So I think that there is still a vast amount of work to do, and a desire to do that work. But it's true that the environment does require a bit more kind of flexibility and maybe, some substantial changes. I'm afraid, it would be in some ways nice to think that we were aiming or, aspiring towards a situation where, in a sense, the need for humanitarian and development actors reduces, but I don't see that, at all, really, in the short or medium term.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Look forward to receiving your application.
Thank you.
ありがとうございます。そうしまして、手を挙げていただいているヒースりょうさん、お願いします。
Hi, thank you for your lecture. I'll try to make it very quick. Yeah, my question is like more about applications. Like I've been working after I graduated master's in agriculture, and I wasn't like studying about social science. Is it like required to, like, for people who have been working, is it required to like have an experience in the development in global development areas, or like is it recommended? Is it okay to like get into this field without the backgrounds?
Yeah, I've got you. Yeah, thank you for that question. No, it's a really good one. And, a lot of people, maybe rather like yourself, will be really kind of looking to kind of make a transition into a new employment area. So I think it's certainly not required that you have professional experience in the development sector. One of the things which I think is, is just very fundamental and important is that professional experience in a very, very wide range of activities and sectors can end up having some relevance and value when we start to think about development processes and interventions. And I think that, we'd be really, enthusiastic about an application from somebody with some work experience who is able to explain to us, how what they've been doing and the things that they are expert in have brought them to a point of interest in relation to development. That's 100% legitimate and interesting, I think. And, depending on the program that people apply for, there is absolutely scope for, becoming familiar and expert in this field in the course of doing the master's. So yeah, I think that sounds like a very welcome application.
Thank you.
I have a feeling that there were one or two questions in the chat.
Yeah,
I don't know when
do you
it
have
would be a good
question
moment
for
me
one
to...
more?
Yeah.
There was
Okay.
a question about any real placement available to experience to take part in NGO or some activity in a foreign area during the study.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So actually, I've realized that I made a bad mistake, which is that I failed to include on my slides our newest program, which is the MSc Global Development with a placement year. So that is one option. Now, in that scenario, the student comes to SOAS, spends a year doing the academic work. During the course of that year, they identify and apply for placement opportunities, which they spend the second year doing. During their placement activity in the second year, they write their development studies dissertation on a subject related to the activity that they're doing in their placement. So that's one option which lengthens the program of study. Another option which doesn't lengthen the program of study is that it's possible to apply for a development placement module, usually in the second teaching semester, in which students, there are a limited number of places, but quite a lot. I think this year we've got 50 or 60 students taking the placement off the top of my head. And then, so that's a slightly different scenario in which students are assisted by the department. They're placed by the department, either in person or remotely, either individually or in groups, in development organizations or development related organizations, to carry out a much shorter term part-time placement, but which nevertheless gives them some, substantive access to networks, to professional experience and so on. And then as part of the module, they write a kind of a reflective piece about the experience that they've had and what they've learned in it. So yeah, we're really, really aware and really supportive of students' desire to try to kind of get some practical hands-on experience while they're studying. And our career service is really brilliant at helping people identify opportunities of those kinds as well.
Okay, I think that was all the questions that we had.
Are there any? Great.
Thank
Okay.
you. その他にご質問などございませんでしょうか。もしなければですね、これで今日は終わりたいと思いますので、よろしい方からご退出いただければと思います。はい、ありがとうございました。
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. If you have any questions, please do reach out to us. I put my email address in the chat, but I'd like to thank Tania so much for the session and SI-UK for facilitating this wonderful webinar. Thank you so much, and we hope to see your applications very soon.
Thanks everyone for coming. It's been really great to engage with you, and I look forward to meeting some of you in person, I hope.
烏山さん、ご質問などございますか？
Okay, I'm going to leave as well now. Thanks so much for facilitating that. It was really, really great.
Thank
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.